So Marcella, why don't you just get started with the introductions, and I'll keep an eye on, and I'll admit people that continue to join, okay?
Okay, great. Well, welcome everybody. Oh, Martha, could you share your screen? You're muted. Welcome everyone. My name is Marcella. I'm the Communications and Administrative Assistant at the Connecticut Food System Alliance. If you joined us on Friday, welcome back. And if you're just joining us today, this is the second session of our 2021 summit, and I'm really glad you could join us. I will pull up the slides. There we go. So you're here for growing our state food plan. We will be talking about a food plan for the state of Connecticut, and we have some great speakers from other New England states who will be speaking on behalf of their state food plan. A few things before we start. This meeting is being recorded. Please mute yourself if you're not speaking. You can unmute yourself when we get into the Q&A section, but during the presentations, please stay muted. If you have any questions during the presentations, please put them in the chat or hold them until we do the first two presentations. We will have about 15 minutes to take some questions after both. So about the Connecticut Food System Alliance, we are a statewide network of dedicated stakeholders committed to creating broad system change and advancing a just, equitable, sustainable food system in Connecticut. We are committed to food justice. Now, food justice seeks to ensure that the benefits and risks of where, what, and how food is grown, produced, transported, distributed, accessed, and eaten are shared fairly. This is from the book on food justice. Next slide, please. Your input here will help shape the food action plan. So we're really glad that so many people are able to join us this morning. A food action plan is a vision for what food and farms should look like for a city, county, state, and ours will consist of current data, what we have now, our vision of what we would like to see, and recommendations for how we are going to get there. The plan will act as a roadmap for community organizations, governments, individuals, businesses, etc., to shape a better food system. And right now, Connecticut is the only state in New England without a food action plan. So this meeting here is part of our way to remedy that. So without further ado, I'll introduce our speakers for today. Our first speaker is Winton Pitcoff. Winton is the director of the Massachusetts Food System Collaborative. Previously, he was project manager for the Massachusetts statewide food system planning process. He is also coordinator of the Massachusetts Maple Producers Association and editor of Maple Syrup Digest, an international trade journal. He's worked on food and agricultural policy issues at all levels of government. He has raised beef cattle, pigs, and dairy goats, owned and operated an ice cream business, and worked for an on-farm yogurt maker and a dairy cooperative. And due to an unfortunate incident involving a hungry mink, Winton no longer raises chickens. So welcome, Winton. I'd like to turn it over to you now. So Martha, if you could stop sharing your screen, we could have Winton take over from here.
Thanks. Give me a minute to do that awkward transition to slides. You did it very smoothly. I'm not as adept. There we go. Everyone sees that? Yes, thank you. So hi everyone, I'm Winton. I'm from the Massachusetts Food System Collaborative, and as mentioned in the introduction, I led our state's process a bunch of years ago to develop a statewide local food action plan. I appreciate you inviting me today, and I commend Connecticut on waiting to do this until you saw how the rest of New England and many other states around the country did it, and what we did right and what we did wrong, so that you guys are going to get it right. So we're all watching you very, very closely on this. So I'm going to talk about the history of how we ended up doing a state food system plan, what the process was like, what the structure was like, what we learned from that process. So the state established a food policy council about 10 years ago, and most states that do a food system plan, one of their recommendations is to establish a food policy council. We like to do things backwards here in Massachusetts, and so we did the council first and then the plan. The council found that it was getting a lot of questions, a lot of organizations and entities coming to them saying, hey, we've got ideas for food system policy or projects. We'd like the council's endorsement. And the council said, well, we don't have a framework to consider those suggestions in. And that's what led to the idea of a food plan. Massachusetts did a food plan back in the 70s and updated it in the 80s. We were the first in the country to do something like this. And so it had been a good long time since we'd sat down and really thought through what we envisioned for the local food system in Massachusetts. So the process began in early 2014. And so the client for the process was the state's Food Policy Council. And so they were the ones that ultimately chose who was going to develop the plan, found the contractors to do it, and stewarded the process along. There was $200,000 allocated for the project in the state's budget that year. Private funders added a little bit more along the way. And so I believe there were 6 private funders, philanthropies that contributed resources as well. The state developed an RFP saying what it was they were looking for and received a number of applications. Who ultimately won the contract was a group of regional planning associations from around the state with a very detailed proposal of an engagement process and of what the ultimate product was going to look like. The engagement process itself lasted 2 years. There were working groups. The working groups were broken out based upon sector of the food system. I'll talk about that a little bit more later. Listening sessions were held both regionally and sectorally. Those of you who are old enough will remember a time where people actually used to gather together in groups, in rooms with multiple people there, speaking directly to each other. And we did a lot of those. We did them in all parts of the state. And then we had sectoral groups as well in the form of the working groups. There was an executive committee, which was made up of the chairs of the working groups. So for instance, the land working group had a chair from American Farmland Trust. And so she also played a role on the executive committee. And so the executive committee, the chairs of those working groups would meet on a regular basis as well as we were moving the project along. We did quite a few one-on-one interviews as well for folks who weren't able to participate in sessions or who had particularly significant roles that we wanted to make sure we really were getting their full range of input. And we had 2 staff people on the process that were doing targeted outreach to underrepresented communities. So BIPOC communities, farmers, folks who typically are shut out of processes like these, who don't feel comfortable in meetings, can't go to meetings for whatever reason. We had staff people who were physically going out and meeting with people where they were. And so they would go to community groups meetings, or they would go talk to people one-on-one. And so altogether, the process took 2 years. There were 5 or 6 planners working on it, not full-time. I was the only full-time person on it, as well as the 2 additional staffers who were working on the targeted outreach. And the plan structure, ultimately, the plan's available online. There'll be a link at the end of the presentation so you can see it there, but was made up of a large section of goals and recommendations and action items, and I'll explain that structure in a little bit. A big chapter on existing conditions, which was basically an atlas of the food system. So things like number of jobs, number of acres, those sorts of things, the economics of the food system in Massachusetts, so that we knew where our baselines were. some recommendations around metrics, and then we had a section of the plan for essentially minority reports. We were very, very diligent about making sure that every step along the way we were getting input from people, including after we'd written the plan. And we had a draft of it several months before the end of the planning process. We made it available to everybody who had participated, as well as people who had wanted to or were aware of it but maybe hadn't, saying, please read this through and send us your comments. And some of those comments were integrated into the final plan. People found typos for us, so that was lovely. But by and large, we weren't giving people an opportunity to overrule what we had said, but we wanted to see if we had missed things or see if there were some perspectives that weren't included. And then we included every single person's comment word for word in a chapter at the end of the report. And that was really important because we had people who were actively involved who did feel like their perspective wasn't necessarily reflected in this. And we wanted to make sure that although things had been winnowed down and we wanted to, whether it was reaching a consensus or a majority position on something, that folks who had a different perspective, we wanted to make sure that they saw themselves in the final plan as well. And so you'll see that in there. Altogether, we talked to about 1,500 people during the planning process. That included individual farmers or individual consumers even, all the way up to large statewide organizations representing thousands of people. So that engagement process was really the core of the work. At the very beginning of the process, we established 4 goals with the client, with the State Food Policy Council, so that we knew we were all working towards the same thing. And I'd encourage anyone doing this sort of thing to make sure that you do this at the beginning, so that you don't come to the end of the process and the client saying to you, geez, we don't agree with one of the big overarching concepts that you were working towards there. And they can be broad and they can be general and they can be as kind of all purpose as these 4 here. Pretty hard to be opposed to any of these goals. How do we produce more food in Massachusetts and get it into more Massachusetts mouths? How do we create jobs and economic opportunity throughout the food system? How do we protect natural resources and reduce hunger? So every other goal, recommendation, or action item in the plan was in service to these 4 goals. As much as we wanted to be doing systems thinking, and we did throughout the process, we had to come up with a hierarchy or a taxonomy to develop the plan. And these are the categories that we broke out as far as working groups and ultimately chapters of the plan. So land inputs included anything related to environmental issues as well as food waste. Farming, there's also a fisheries working group, processing, distribution, marketing, food access, and health. And so those were the breakout groups that were having these discussions. The through lines that ran through all of the discussions that every working group was charged with making sure were included somewhere in their recommendations were issues around workforce, issues around the environment and sustainability, and issues around equity. And then the ultimate recommendations that were made fell into 3 large categories: education, regulation, and support. And how do we provide those 3 things to the stakeholders that ultimately need to be implementing the plan? And then we had a section on implementation and basically who's going to do this, and acknowledge that there were really 3 stakeholders involved. One was the legislature, one was the administration, and one was the private sector stakeholders. And I'm talking about state level here. And the legislature and administration obviously were well organized in and of themselves, but the stakeholders didn't have a large network organization to help coordinate their efforts in facilitating the plan. And that led to the formation of the Massachusetts Food System Collaborative. To give you an example of the hierarchy of things in the plan, and again, you can find this online, we were looking at big, broad, overarching goals. That was those first 4 goals that we were talking about. And then within each chapter, we looked at a set of goals for that particular sector. So we were looking in here at the processing section. And one of the goals was food processing regulations will support businesses. Nice and broad, big picture. Obviously, we need the thing is we're pointing out that regulations are an issue. Within that, we need recommendations. So what does it mean to actually get to that goal? How are we going to know when we've gotten there? Well, we want to see consistency in how those regulations are enforced. And then action items were the most discrete, the real doable, workable items in the plan. And so one of the action items under this goal and recommendation was to increase the number of inspectors and their capacity. So that gives you a sense of how we laid out the plan. And I'm working through my time faster than expected, so I'm going to move a little faster here. But we learned a lot during the process, and we can talk about this during the Q&A and the breakout sessions, but I want to hit on a few key things here. So a good planning process is not just planning, but it's also education and organizing. A lot of folks who are coming to the table are have tunnel vision on their own part of the food system, and they're not necessarily thinking broadly. This is a chance to educate them. So just coming in to if you're having working group meetings or whatever and saying, okay, what do people want to see? We really found early on that we needed to make sure that everyone was on the same page, and we really needed to be bringing everyone up to speed so that everyone was starting from the same point and thinking about what they wanted to see for the overall food system. And then when I say organizing, you want people who participate to feel like they've got a stake in this process so that they will then follow it through to participate in the implementation of whatever comes of it. And that gets back to the earlier comment I made about having minority reports in the final document. Anyone who's ever been involved in a planning process, the first thing you do when you see the final report come out is you flip through it and you see, well, where is what I said in here? And so you really want to make sure that part of the organizing component of the planning process is making sure that people feel really vested in the process. Engagement is key, but you need to know when you're done. You're never going to talk to everybody. And it's really important that you cast a wide net. It's really important that you make a lot of opportunities available for people to participate in the ways that they feel comfortable. Some people don't like participating in big groups. You got to make sure you can talk to them one-on-one. Some people don't like participating orally, and so you got to make sure that people can submit written comments and all of that. So engagement is absolutely key, but you can make yourself crazy worrying that you haven't reached absolutely every single person. And you will see a point during the process where there's a point of diminishing returns, where you're starting to hear the same things over and over again. And so you can recognize that you've maybe gotten to a point where you've heard all the perspectives you're going to hear on that sort of thing. But I will say there's always going to be tensions and there's always going to be outliers. And so where I think some plans go is say, okay, we're trying to have a unified document here. Let's skip those tensions and let's make sure that we only come out with something that's a consensus document. And I think that's a missed opportunity. I think the outliers are often the most interesting things. I think it's okay to have a plan that says we didn't solve this, but here's who needs to be at the table, and here's the kind of process that could solve this later on. And that was something the Massachusetts plan did have, and one of the collaborative's first projects was hiring a professional mediator to solve one of the more thorny issues. And it ended up being a very good process and one of the collaborative's first successes. Who's in the room will really determine the kind of plan you end up with. We had a lot of policy people there, and so our plan was very policy oriented. And it's very important that, particularly when you have the state as a client, to establish early on that this is not something that's being done to the state, that this is a partnership and that you're there because that the planners are there and the people participating in the planning process are there because they ultimately want to support the state in doing better in supporting the state's food system. So it's not something, one of the things that we made sure of throughout the plan was that when we said we want the state to do X, Y, and Z, or we want this agency to do this better, it was always understood and most often explicitly stated, we want them to do this better, and therefore we want them to have the money to do it better. We recognize that it takes resources to do more. We're identifying what's needed, and we want to make sure that we're partnering with the state and with the policymakers to get them the resources they need in order to do this stuff better. you want to be very clear on what completion means and what and who owns that the final plan. As silly as this sounds, we got to the end of the process. We brought the final plan to the Food Policy Council, and they had multiple lawyers in there to decide what it was that they were doing with the plan. Were they approving it? Probably not, because approving the plan would suggest that it's now state policy. There were recommendations in the plan, for instance, that called for a living wage. The people on the Food Policy Council don't have the authority to say the state's now committed to a living wage. So you want to make sure that you're in agreement with, and there's a mutual understanding of what completion of the process means. For us, it meant that the plan was done and the Food Policy Council accepted it. And basically that meant they said we had completed our contract, we did what they paid us to do. Thank you very much. And then that leads to the final very important point, is to have an implementation plan. There was concern in Massachusetts that we would finish this plan and everyone would go on their merry way, and who was going to own it and hold the vision of the plan. And so part of the implementation chapter of the plan was for to establish a statewide organization that would hold that vision and would organize stakeholders towards overseeing facilitation, advocacy where that was needed, networking where that was needed, et cetera. And so having that was really critical. That led to the establishment of the collaborative. And also I would say that the state has stepped up and owned the plan to a certain extent. We now have the states in the legislature, we have the Food System Caucus, which didn't exist before the plan. And the Food Policy Council does much of its work in service to the recommendations of the plan. And I'll wrap up there. I'll just mention the collaborative, and that's a link to our website. And these are some of the reports that we've done over the years, along with all of our projects, of keeping tabs on how things are going with the food plan. And so the first two are ones that we did in 2018, 3 years after the plan was completed. One on the public sector progress, what laws had passed, what new investments had been made, what regulations had changed, and one on a progress report on local action and community-based action. And then the one furthest on the right there is perspectives on resilience and recovery. We did last year. It had been 5 years since the plan was completed, but it was also in the middle of COVID. So it was a chance to really look at the plan again and say, is it still relevant? Are there maybe new things that we've learned in the interim since the plan was completed? Are there opportunities to maybe highlight some things that were in the plan initially that we want to prioritize differently now, and setting out some goals and recommendations for the next 5 years. So I really encourage you to identify who's going to be keeping tabs and who's going to be moving the plan forward. So I'll stop there and hand it back to Marcella, and available for questions and answers on this session, as well as anytime. I'll actually put my email address in the chat so you can reach out to me as needed.
Marcella, do you want me to share my screen again for introducing Tanya?
Yeah, that would be great. So yes, now I will be introducing our second speaker, Tanya Swain. Tanya provides overall project management for the Maine Food Strategy and support for the initiative's steering committee and leadership team. She's a former executive director of Western Mountains Alliance, a community development organization that led several initiatives to support the development of farm and agriculture-related businesses in rural Maine. Tanya's background includes nonprofit management, program development, fundraising, and public relations. In addition to working with the Maine Food Strategy, she works with groups on strategic planning, organizational development, and project management through Small Fish Consulting Group. She holds an MA in Public Policy and Management from the University of Southern Maine and Portland, and a BA in Political Science from the University of Washington, Seattle. Welcome, Tanya. Martha, you could stop sharing your screen, and Tanya, you can now share yours.
Thanks, Marcella. Very excited to be here and to share sort of our story. And I'm going to try and pull up my presentation. Let's see if this works. Can you guys see that?
Yep.
Yep. Okay, excellent. So I work with the Maine Food Strategy in Maine. I'm going to talk a little bit about our story, similar in some ways to Massachusetts, different in other ways. I'm going to try and move to my next slide. There we go. So our process started with a group. It was sort of an ad hoc group of NGOs and funders that came together and launched an RFP for a planning process. And the interest in Maine in trying to do a food plan, I think, corresponded with what was happening in Vermont at the time. Farm to Plate was getting started. Food Solutions New England was working on the food vision. And a lot of the funders, from what I had heard anecdotally in Maine, were seeing a lot of many different organizations working on food systems issues. And they were saying, is there a way we can get folks to organize around some priorities and be more strategic? And so that was sort of how the concept for a plan in Maine started. And that group came together. They ended up doing this RFP process. They hired the Muskie School at University of Southern Maine to create the plan and also to create some systems to support collaboration. And I'll talk a little bit more about this in a moment, but one of the challenges that we had was that the group that came together to start this RFP process, they at some point decided that once they hired the university to do the process, they were going to disband. So essentially we had the university hired to do a process, but we didn't really have a steering committee. And so the initiative sort of had to struggle with legitimacy from the very beginning, like who was driving the plan, who was in charge. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment, but that was definitely one of our challenges. See if I can move that. There we go. So I'm going to talk some more and sort of what our process was like. We did not have support from state government. And also at the time that our plan was happening, we had an administration that was pretty anti-planning in Maine. So they had, for example, abandoned our state planning office. There was definitely sort of a feel in Augusta in Maine that planning wasn't necessarily valuable. So again, sort of another challenge we had was that we really didn't have the state engaged in the way that some of the other states have had. We did try to get Commissioner Department of Agriculture to be on our first steering committee, but his participation was really not active. And so that was another thing that we struggled with. And I would say I would encourage anybody that's thinking about doing this to try to make sure that the timing is right for your state in terms of having a relationship with state government. All that said, we ended up forming this interim design committee to help us develop a steering committee. And we did sort of an open nomination process. We had about 80 folks that applied to be part of our first steering committee. And then we developed some criteria to select from that group who would serve. And there were about 21 folks on that first group. We tried to have representation from across different sectors, but we didn't have people that were representing organizations on the committee. So for example, we didn't have a seat for state government or a seat for Maine Organic Farmers and Gardeners Association. We just tried to have people that were interested and engaged and somehow connected to the different sectors. And we organized it that way based in part on some of the input that we got from Vermont, from their Farm to Plate process. So once we put together this first steering committee, we then also did a pretty extensive review of past food plans in Maine and elsewhere. And actually the individual that did that review is our commissioner right now for agriculture, Amanda Beal. So she went over and reviewed I think she reviewed 200 different plans and basically called out just a number of different recommendations from those planning processes. We did a publication that was called a Fisheries Primer. We were trying to integrate fisheries in our food planning. That was a challenge as well. Not a lot of connectivity between the sectors. People didn't always see the relationship there. And so we just tried to basically start to educate people on how this is connected and why it's important to have fisheries as part of the conversation. And then we also did a legislative review of some of the policies that our legislature was considering at around the time that we were thinking about planning, and trying to get a sense of what they were looking at and what was coming across as important at the policy level. And so that was all part of our pre-planning stage. And then, of course, similar to Winton, the first stage of the process, like Massachusetts, was getting some sense of what the values and goals were. And the way that we approached this was sort of internally through our steering committee and then out. So we had, again, about 21 people, I'm recalling, on the steering committee, and we ended up contracting with an organization called Yellowwood Associates that does a process called You Get What You Measure. Some of you may have been through this before. Farm to Institution New England used it, for example. It's sort of like a root cause analysis in a sense, but you're working with a group to start to brainstorm after you establish some values and goals, what is going to impact those different areas, and then trying to come to some consensus on what the areas of work are that are going to have the most impact, and then what would be changing in the system that would indicate that what you're working on is having an impact. And I'd be happy to share more information on that process if anybody's interested, or you can certainly get in touch with Yellowwood. For us, it was helpful in getting our steering committee to come to consensus around values and goals, which actually took quite a while for our group. And also out of that process, we came up with a set of key leverage indicators, which were essentially conditions that had a relationship to the goal, but had a higher impact. And then these key results indicators, which is what would change if we were having an impact. And I'm going to show you a document in a moment where we incorporated that in the planning process and used it sort of as the foundation. So I mentioned the past research, and one of the first steps we did when we started to plan was we took the information that came from those various reports and then called out the recommendations that were made around different actions and started to align them with our goals and values in this sort of massive working document that we used in some subcommittees, and I'll talk about that in a moment. So just to show you an example of what this working document looked like. So we had 4 value areas, and I'll go over those in a moment, but each of the value areas had a section of this document. And what we started to do was to capture the different recommendations that had been made from past reports. And then you can also see in this version of the document where, for example, the last row there, we reference a survey. So we had started to do some outreach through surveys, through presentations. There's the first row talks about a trade show presentation. And what we were trying to do, similar to what Massachusetts was doing with transparency, was to show where ideas were coming from and to try to have transparency around who was influencing the process and where we were getting suggestions for recommendations from. And so we tried to carry this throughout the whole process so that if anybody had questions where things were coming from or what the legitimacy was or why somebody focused on that, we could at least go back and say, well, this is the research that was behind that idea, or this is the group that was advocating for this. So as far as the overall planning process, the way we had it structured is our steering committee came up with that initial set of values and goals. We then put those back out to a broad group of stakeholders through some surveys and through a number of outreach meetings that were mostly in connection with other organizations' meetings. One thing we didn't do is we didn't say, okay, this is the Maine Food Strategy process and we're having these meetings on these dates. We tended to say, we're going to these groups on these dates to tell you about what we're thinking about and ask for your input. So that's how we generated a lot of the input on the planning as we were going through the process. And then in terms of the structure for who was making decisions and things like that, our steering committee broke into subcommittees around value areas. And each of those committees then had anybody basically that was interested in working on those areas be part of these discussions. And they would use that planning document and essentially go through and evaluate the different recommendations and start to hone in on which ones they thought were most aligned with this root cause analysis and what they thought would have the most impact. They'd come up with a version of it, we'd put it back out for feedback and do that several times. And then we also did try to do some outreach to what we called harder to reach communities. So which in Maine was like, we have a lot of migrant workers here. We do have some immigrant communities that are engaged with agriculture. And we organized some focus groups with those different populations to try to get some input. And then, as I mentioned before, we did not structure a process where we said, like, this is the Maine Food Strategy, 2015 meetings and where we'll be. We instead said, we're going to come to all these different stakeholder groups and try to connect with them. And one of the reasons that we structured it that way was because early on, the input that we got was that, particularly for farmers, that farmers were feeling especially tapped with people consistently asking them to come to stuff and give their input, and that folks would be more interested in having us show up at their tables. So when we got through the whole process, these were the value areas that we came up with. And I think it's really interesting that all the New England plans that have been organized to date have generally come up with the same values and goals. Economic development, and economic development that's connected to lasting livelihood, sustainability, healthy food for everybody, the idea of communities being connected to food production and what that looks like in terms of ecology and local economies. And then, of course, the idea of environment and sustainability and resilience. And I think if you look at all the New England plans, it's a very similar set of values and goals that people were focused on. And so one of the things that I learned through this process, and I saw through some other planning processes in Maine, is that the plan obviously generates goals and values and actions, and you hope that those get implemented and that you're organizing very intentionally around that. But the process itself of bringing people together to think through this stuff and talk, and if it has some credibility, just having that plan in place, people do start to pick it up and incorporate it in their work. And you can typically see over time how things have changed and where people have carried some of those actions forward, even if there was no sort of structured process in place for implementation. So our plan was published in 2016. Am I way off on time? Time do I have, Marcella? 10:40. All right, try to wrap this up.
Yes, thank you.
Yes, a quick overview, and I'll share a link to the document in the chat, and you can see that. But in addition to some goals and recommendations, quite a few on action items, we tried to identify organizations outside of our own that were working in the different goal areas, and some data sources that could be used to track change. Our goals, again, I'll share the document in the chat so that you all can look at this. I won't go over this, but it's probably what you might expect for goals for a food systems plan. And what it accomplished, I talked about some of this, but I think what we didn't do is we didn't set specific measurable time-bound goals, which a lot of folks really want from a plan. And that was partly because of our process. It was very grassroots. And we didn't have, as I mentioned before, we didn't have a state government behind us sort of backing what was coming out of this and sort of taking that to the next level. And then we weren't able to establish systems for ongoing evaluation. So this has all kind of been kind of ad hoc as we move forward with the plan and look at where things are getting implemented and what still needs to be done. 3 years, why did it take so long? Some people think that's long, some people don't. But I think in a lot of states, there's turf issues. As I mentioned before, the state government role, and we definitely had a lot of intense political divisions when we were trying to do our process, and it definitely took some time to work through those. And then in terms of what we learned, the original founders staying engaged, I think, is really important to an initiative's success. Having diversity built into the first governing group, buy-in from state government seems very critical. The collaborative approach requires time, and we also ran up against capacity issues for organizations. Everybody's struggling with resources and staffing. And then I think in terms of funding, one of the big takeaways is just trying to sustain funding for these types of initiatives, planning and networks is definitely challenging. This is some information on how we're staffed and governed and funded currently. Right now, we have a half-time project director, and we use contract project staff, and we switched to a fiscal agent around the time that the plan was published. I talked a little bit about implementation, and I won't go into this because I know we're short on time, but basically where we're at right now is we have these focus areas that we're working to promote, and we're really focused on developing partnerships between networks that are organized around some of those goal areas in the plan. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Tanya. So now I think I'd like to open it up to some questions. You can either put them in the chat, or you can unmute yourself to ask either Tanya or Winton any of your questions.
And Marcella, I think there were, well, there was one question about soil health very early on. And so maybe we can just read that out. And then there was, can the presenter slideshows be shared? I'm presuming the answer is going to be yes.
Yes, I'll be sending out slideshows and a recording of the event after that's all done.
So let me, Nasri, did you want to ask your own question, or did you want me to just read it? I'm happy to do that. You there? All right, so there was a request to discuss just Sri just saw an interesting webinar, like how to maximize the potential of soil related with food plan. And I'm not sure I completely understand that question, but I guess that overall soil health probably is something that entered into the plan, into the summit, at least some of the thinking of both Massachusetts and Maine's food plans. Is that true? And if so, how?
I'm sorry, Martha, can you say that again, the last part of the question?
It's how did soil health, what did the concept of how do you maintain and keep healthy soils in your states? I mean, because agriculture being like really important elements of these plans, how did that enter into your thinking, and how is it reflected in the plan?
So it came up quite a bit in our process, and I just looked, and there's 11 action items in the plan that refer specifically to soil, whether it's around compost or around public education about soil issues. Urban ag is a big part of our plan, and so there was quite a bit about making sure that state investments were made in remediation of unhealthy soil in areas where they're growing food in cities. So yes, I think is the shorter answer. Soil should absolutely be part of any good food system plan.
So since I'm already unmuted, can I ask a question? And I think that actually two of them, and one of them I think is pretty specific to Massachusetts. Winton, is there any downside to having the state as the client? I mean, and because the Maine plan is much more grassroots.
Right.
Massachusetts, one of the reasons we thought that it would be great to have both of you here is that there are kind of like a couple of different trajectories, but what are the upsides and downsides of having the state as your customer for this?
So anyone can raise, I'm making it sound too simple, but you know what I mean. Anyone can raise money, put together a team, write a plan, and publish a plan, and not necessarily have the state involved in that process. That might be, there might be some more flexibility to that. I can see that. There might be, you might be able to push some boundaries in ways that you might feel like you can't when the state's at the table. But the state having skin in the game by having paid for the lion's share of the plan and for having actually been the client and essentially being at the table through the whole process means there's a much higher likelihood of the state actually following through on some of the things and owning it and feeling like this is something we want to see happen. And so, you know, for example, every time there's a grant RFP put out by the State Department of Agricultural Resources now in Massachusetts, one of the criteria for applicants is that they've got to demonstrate how their project helps address some of the goals raised in the plan. That sort of ownership only comes, I think, when the state is at the table from the beginning. I think that we were able to make it clear at the beginning that the state was at the table, they were investing in this, but they didn't have veto power. They were one of the partners there in the process, but they weren't going to, get to look at a draft and see, oh, this says that, we need to have X, Y, and Z. We don't want to see that in the plan. And they didn't even try. And like I said, there's things in there like a living wage, or like having more inspectors for something, or investing more resources into X, Y, or Z. And they didn't get in the way of doing that, of having that in the plan. It's not to say they've done all of it. A lot of it they haven't done. But having them at the table, I think, ultimately worked out well in the Massachusetts situation.
I just want to reiterate what Winton said. I mean, I think it's really important to have the state engaged. And I think that has been something that we have struggled with. And one of the reasons that it took us quite a while to actually come up with our published plan was because there is legitimacy and credibility that comes with the state backing something, that when you have other groups that don't have that accountability, it's just hard to build that.
Yeah. Every time I've sent a letter to the legislature in support of a bill or something, saying that the plan supports it, I say that the plan, which was accepted by the Food Policy Council, which includes representatives of 6 state agencies as well as 4 legislators, supports this idea. So it gives you that sort of gravitas. Because just me, I got no gravitas at all.
I have a question. Okay to jump in?
Yep.
It's Karen Brown, Fairfield County's Community Foundation. I was intrigued, but from both Winton and Tanya, that private philanthropy or private foundations in Massachusetts and Connecticut got the ball rolling by helping to fund. Can you explain a little bit more about the role of private philanthropy in the process, and then also what lessons learned, if any, related to the way that private philanthropy interacts with state agencies? Because I think that, the dance between private philanthropy and state government is sometimes a intricate one. And I'm just wondering if there are any lessons learned for Connecticut. Thanks.
Go ahead, Tanya.
So it's so interesting. I think that the planning processes, and this has to do with credibility and legitimacy, they have to have transparency. And sometimes with funders, that's hard to get at, actually. I will say, though, without the funders in Maine, we wouldn't have launched our plan. And at one point in our process, I recall one of our steering committee members talking about how these things are iterative. So we have a plan that we did in Maine. Our state government wasn't ready to engage when we did this. We have some legislation in right now that we're hoping is going to develop into the state being more proactive in some longer term planning moving forward. Maybe we needed to do this first to get us to that place. So I think I think philanthropists can be instigators and incubators, and that's a really valuable role. The transparency piece seems really important.
Yeah, I'd agree with everything Tanya said. I think that what helped us bring in some philanthropy at the beginning was us saying, we've got some money from the state, and we can do the planning process with the money that's available from the state. But if philanthropy steps in and gives us a little bit more, we can have a much broader engagement process, and we can make sure, so it's not just saying, hey, support the plan. It's giving them a real specific thing that's targeted towards the thing that they're interested in. And engagement is always one of those things. Since then, obviously, the collaborative it doesn't get any money from the state, and but is funded entirely by private foundations. Many of whom were involved in the planning process to begin with. So there's a nice through line there. implementation is challenging. Massachusetts has a lot of local food system infrastructure in terms of our buy local organizations, a lot of good public health groups, a lot of good food access organizations. So we decided early on the collaborative was not going to be an operating organization, and that we weren't going to have programs and projects. We were going to focus on policy and on teaching people how to engage in policy advocacy. Don't do that. Because it's really hard to fund policy-only organizations. Because a lot of funders are scared of policy. They think, oh, you're a lobbyist, you're evil, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that a good mix of an organization that both does projects and programs, but also makes people aware of the opportunities for advocacy and the opportunities for systemic policy change is more sustainable.
I just want to give, though, a quick shout out just to the funders in New England. I mean, this has been a giant experiment with all these state plans, and it's just amazing what we've learned and what has happened as a result of whatever role they decided to play in the different states. So we wouldn't be in the place we're at, I don't think, without that. So it's been pretty amazing.
Yeah, and I'm thinking I really want to echo something that Tanya just said, and also that funders, when you're engaged in this type of work, and if you're willing to fund this type of work, there needs to be an appetite for the long haul, because what you can get done in a year in like normal grant timelines don't necessarily apply to planning processes, and certainly don't apply to fundamental environmental and policy change. So I think that is I think that might bear some thought.
Just a quick follow-up question for Tanya. Was the Maine Community Foundation a funder? Because you're lucky in that you have a statewide community foundation covering your entire state of Maine.
They were one of the first funders, and they were also very involved in getting the RFP process organized. And one of the other early funders was connected to them as well. So they definitely played an important role.
Thanks.
And I'm just looking through the participants list, and I don't see any of my funders on here. So I'll say, funders have a short attention span sometimes. And they, we've been on this crest of funders being interested in food system issues for a while. And it was starting to wane actually before the pandemic. And funders really stepped up again during the pandemic around food issues. And this is why I think looking systemically and thinking about the connections between food and transportation and food and housing and all of these things helps funders recognize that they need to be thinking holistically as well. And so that's one way to keep funders engaged.
Other questions? Because I've got a couple more. But
I have a question.
Okay, Peggy.
Yeah. So first of all, thank you. There's great presentations and learned a lot. My question is I know there's been a lot that has come out of the food plans, and but can you, either one of you or both, point to something specific that may have changed in the state because of the food plan? I just the fact that people look at it and use it as a guide is fabulous. So that's a good reason to have a food plan. But I'm just wondering if there was some specific changes in some part of the food system that changed directly because of the plan.
Go ahead, Tanya.
I'm thinking about, a lot of this has to do with process, but one of the things I think that's changed, and this is also in connection to philanthropy, some of the feedback that we got from producers through the process of our plan, and also through some subsequent planning that happened with the ag community, was this interest in seeing how philanthropic dollars could be used to support businesses differently. And I think that some of the shift in the conversation that's happened in Maine started with this planning process and people coming to the table and saying, how do we funnel some of these dollars into actually supporting businesses? And then outside of that, there have been some legislative things tied to some of the goal areas in the plan, although I don't think you can draw a straight line to that.
Oh, you got to take more credit than that, Tanya. So, you know, I think that in Massachusetts, you know, there are a number of items in the plan, recommendations or action items that can be checked off. And I think they are because of the plan amplifying those issues, and they're because of the work that's been done since the plan in getting people more active and engaged. And so, you know, the collaboratives work has been primarily around working with stakeholder organizations that haven't done policy work, and we sort of try to be the policy staff for those organizations in some ways. And so various campaigns that we've been a part of or have led since then, there's a couple of things that have led to some significant investments in the SNAP doubling program and some funding last year around response to COVID that have totaled $98 million. And we're in the process right now of how to spend the ARPA money. And the first draft of that bill comes out with $78 million from local food systems. So that's a pretty good return on investment. There's definitely some bills that have passed, some things around school meals, some things around of local boards of health now have to work more closely with farmers. There's quite a bit like that. I think though that the lasting impact is that when I hear from a farmer saying, I've never talked to a legislator before, but now I have, that's really cool. Or the legislature that decided to establish a food system caucus, the first of its kind in the country, which is now the second largest caucus in the Massachusetts State House, that is looking at food system bills in a holistic way. That's going to have some long-term impact on the way the state looks at food policy. It's not perfect. There's a lot that we haven't done. There's a lot that feels like beating our heads against the wall. But I think the plan can at least take the credit for being the catalyst for a lot of those things.
Great, thank you. All great stuff.
All right, I think we need to move on to the next part. But if you have any more questions, please put them in the chat. We can maybe get around to them at the way end of this session, but I'd like to turn it over to Martha and Serena, members of Connecticut Food System Alliance Steering Committee, to talk a little bit about where Connecticut's State Food Action Plan is and some of the goals that we've established for the coming years. So I'll turn it over to them. Martha, you're muted.
All right, that won't help if I'm doing this slide and talking away and nobody can hear me. So sorry about that. So we were slowed down a little bit by the pandemic, but not as much as we anticipated. I mean, so many things were turned upside down, but we have been, you know, a few years ago, we had dipped our toe into the water of thinking that we needed to have this plan and we needed to get serious about it. And now I think that over the last couple of years, we really have. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of what we have accomplished and then a little bit about a timeline. And then Serena will talk a little bit about our connection to other work that's related. I think that one of the things that I heard from both Tanya and Winton that resonates with us is that, you know, the critical nature of just getting individuals, organizations, government agencies to agree that this is a needed thing, that it is valuable for us to actually have a planning process and to, you know, and to just have a framework for everyone to operate within. But on a practical level, we have, like, in addition to doing that, kind of like building support, we have engaged in a number of like listening and input sessions with farmers, urban farmers, food policy councils, and community groups across the state. We have expanded our Connecticut Food System Alliance Steering Committee to get many more voices at the table. from across the state. And I think that is really paying dividends in terms of just getting more and more voices into the process. Supported by some USDA funding, but very much connected to the plan, is a potential framework for a statewide farmers market network and collaborative, which we've made some significant progress on within the last year. Talked to a lot of market managers, talked to a lot of farmers, talked to a lot of farmers market customers, and we are in the process of compiling all of those findings, and we'll be issuing those findings within the next couple of months. This maybe sounds a little bit like a duh, but putting a stake in the ground, saying when do we want to have something finished, it's been a little hard for us to arrive at that, but I think we're there. And I'm going to, just show a very brief timeline on the next page. But part of the process that we are engaged in now is that we, like Maine, I think that Tanya made the point of how many different plans they looked at to kind of like begin to arrive at some of the things that should be included in their plan. We're doing the same thing. And existing state municipal food action plans, we are feeling very empowered to steal freely from our partners across the region and elsewhere. But we're also trying to be very conscious that there are contiguous plans that will make a big difference in food system planning, such as the recent Governor's Council on Climate Change recommendations. And there are a lot of food and environment components in that are critical when you think about the future of food system here in Connecticut. And then we're not going to be able to do this without data. And so we are in the process of reviewing data sources. What do we have? What don't we have? And what will be the plan to fill any gaps that we identify? And here's our stake in the ground. We have been throughout 2022, we are going to actually develop the framework of what the plan will look like. It will have a strong underpinning of equity, that this is not going to be an element in the plan, it is going to be the foundation for the plan. And then, as I talked about, kind of like doing assessments of where can we draw from so that we're not operating with a blank sheet of paper. And then in 2023, we hope to draft the plan and to potentially have legislative action that will support this. And then by 2024, have it finished. So now, Serena, do you want me to keep my, just keep sharing the screen? I can go to the next slide. I think
that'd be easiest. Thank you.
Okay. All right.
All right. Hey, all, just quickly, I think I know a lot of you, but I'm Serena. I'm at the Connecticut Department of Agriculture, and I'm on the CFSA steering committee, and I also provide administrative support for the Connecticut Food Policy Council. So I'm just going to go into a little bit more detail about the timeline that Martha kind of just went over. So to back up, at the beginning of 2021, the CFSA steering committee was kind of reformed and reconvened, and there's been a small subgroup that has, been meeting every month to every other month to kind of start establishing work towards the food plan. And the hope is that in 2022, that can be broadened out to more than just kind of the 6 or 7 people that it's currently at. And so that's going to be a main focal point for, beginning in 2022, but extended throughout. Martha also mentioned completing an assessment of relevant state planning efforts. So, we acknowledge that there's a lot of work going on in the state already, be it at the state level or at municipal level or with community groups. And so both want to glean from the work that's already going on, but also not be duplicative of those efforts. And kind of, a main goal is to figure out where the CFSA fits in, how this plan can amplify efforts that are already going on as well. And so both of these kind of points of networking and the assessment, we're going to delve into when we go into the breakout groups and get some feedback from you all. And then the last point is Martha mentioned, the need for equity to be at the center of this report. So kind of really thinking through where are the values of the report, where do they lie, and how are we actually actualizing when we're saying we're putting equity at the center? Like, what does that mean? What does that look like? And Allie, I just saw, sorry, I can't see the chat at the same time. So if you want to, feel free to unmute yourself at the end and say your point.
Just to add that in tandem with within the steering committee, in tandem with the Food Action Plan Committee is a networking building committee that is with the ideas to support the efforts of the plan.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. I think I'm ready for the next slide, Martha. Thanks.
Okay. All right. Okay.
Okay. And then shifting gears a little bit, but I think when or Tanya mentioned the New England Feeding New England project. And so this is kind of one other aspect that the CFSA and the plan is looking to engage with. So for all who don't know, so New England Feeding New England is a regional network or collaborative with all of these state groups that you can see that kind of act as the food system planning group for their states. And they're looking at a regional approach of how do we feed New England with the land base and the processing capacity that currently exists, and or what needs to be put in place for that to happen. And so that's definitely a group that the plan is going to engage with and acknowledge the work that is going on. Meg and Martha are really involved in that group. And I know that I went to their first meeting, and so they have occasional kind of meetings that they open up to everyone. And I'm sure Marcella will send those out to everyone on the listserv and who registered, because it would be great to just have more people engaged and involved in that.
And that the next one, by the way, is going to be on November 16th. So there will be another update on that. I do want to point out here on there that the New England Feeding New England Project Collaborative is kind of like its own project, but it is working very closely with Food Solutions New England and the overall New England food vision. And there are a lot of connection points between these projects, including on the steering, like both Serena and I are on the network team of Food Solutions New England, so that, so there's a lot of like good connection points to make sure that everybody's talking and that we are not operating in separate silos. And then,
all right.
I will wait for this. Okay.
We're not at the end yet. So thank you, Martha and Serena. Right now, we're going to shift into breakout groups. We'll be in there for about 35 minutes. And we will be using the Jamboard to take some notes. So I'm going to quickly share the link in the chat one more time. Once you're in your breakout groups, just find your facilitator's name on your respective Jamboard and start taking notes. But let's see how this turns out.
I'm reminded of an old saying that who are who are the right people to be in any group are the people who are here. So it's so welcome back.
Wherever you go, there you are, kind of thing.
Oh, here we go. We got lots more.
All right. So thank you, everybody. I know my group was hoarding Tanya for a little bit, but thank you, Tanya and Winton, for participating in the breakout groups and answering, I'm sure, a lot of our lingering questions. if we could just go really quickly, each breakout group do like a 1 to 2 sentence recap of what you talked about. I know we must have captured a bunch on the Jamboard, but I'm just interested if we could go group by group.
All right, well, group one, that's me, will not have captured a lot on Jamboard because but I do have a lot that I actually wrote. Okay, so I will write it up later. But we had like very, we also monopolized Winton for a little while too, so we're very much appreciate his input. But there was a lot of good input from the group. That there was a strong endorsement of using a framework of equity as kind of like just a basis for how we develop this plan. There were suggestions of groups that we should make sure that we're connected with, everything from Connecticut Renews to the Conference of Municipalities, Sustainable CT, mutual aid groups, and that keeping the process open is really, really important, and not don't be a slave to speed. Okay, do this right. But kind of like, keep doing with forward progress. So that was my 45-second recap. I'll leave it at there.
Thanks, Martha. I think Serena's group was group 2.
Yeah. So a point that was kind of echoed a few times in our group is the need to really look not only across the state and the New England region, but kind of throughout the US at like what are not just food system plans, but what are food system policies. And when we say food system policies, we're very much talking about kind of the different, or, where are the cross linkages with healthcare, with housing, with workforce development, kind of where are those policies, what do they look like, and what can we learn from them, and kind of use that as a starting point and framework. So it's not just kind of starting from scratch, but having a really kind of informed work already going in when we're getting feedback. And then another point that was really great, I thought, is kind of echoing, a combination of networking from both Maine and Massachusetts of, yes, having some kind of meet groups where they're at approach of going to groups, but for that to really work, it needs to have like a genuine relationship and connection. You can't just kind of be showing up to their group for your needs. You have to be a part of it. So having some combination of outreach of that methods, but then having really targeted outreach of this is the purpose of this meeting or this focus group or facilitation, whatever it is, that people will come to and are really interested and can be engaged throughout the process. Yeah, and I think I'll leave it from there. We had a lot of other great comments, but check out our Jamboard.
Thanks, Serena. Peggy's group.
So we had great conversations, and Jenny's gonna share that with the group. She was good at the Jamboard.
Hi, everyone. Like Peggy said, we had a really great discussion. I think similar to some of the points Serena was making, the two that sort of stuck out and worked kind of in concert with each other were, first, making sure that we're getting real buy-in from people with authority to implement the plan and make the plan actionable. And on the flip side of that, if we are going out into the community, getting these trusted resources in the community to sort of get input and buy-in from community members, making sure that when we're doing that, we're also communicating how this plan is going to be implemented, how it's going to be actionable, and showing them that they're not just going to contribute their time and effort and energy and thought to then never see a result. So just making sure we have a way to communicate to them, here's what you can see down the line, and following up, keeping in touch with them, keeping them looped in. And like I said, really great discussion, wonderful group, and check out the Jamboard for the rest of the comments. We took good notes.
Thanks, Jenny. I'm going to pass my group's little recap off to Sean.
Yeah, to summarize, hold on. Can you hear me?
Yes, you're unmuted.
Yeah, all right, good. Yeah, to summarize, I mean, the main threads that we had, I mean, great dialogue, community input, and open conversation with the endpoints seem to be the common thread. That how do we get in touch and make sure that we're communicating with everybody all the way up and down the line. How do we use models that currently exist in neighboring communities, neighboring states, neighboring regions, and start to kind of implement them and make them ours? But the communication thread seemed to be the ever-present one. How do you make it better? How do you make people feel that that their opinions matter? That we need their opinions, that we're looking for opinions and input and contribution all the way across the board. So that was those were our primary themes amongst a lot of great points and conversations. So
Thanks, Sean. I'm going to pivot to Erin's group.
Sure. So also had a great group, lots of ideas. Going back to what Martha was saying, we did talk a lot about the process and making sure that that process doesn't get stale as it forms, and continually looking at who's involved and making sure to include new players as they come into the fold. Talked about looking at other states, but also other countries and how they approach working with producers, working with food production and food insecurity. There was some discussion about looking at Russia and how people are growing on small plots. That sort of turned us to the importance of soil and climate change, which was a big idea. And then with regards to inclusion, one thing that came up was really including youth and thinking about the demographics and different people's schedules. So we were discussing the youth and how, as we are all working professionals, or many of us are, we are working during the days, we're planning our meeting during the days, and we really miss that input from the youth, who will be the future of what happens here in Connecticut. So just keeping that in mind and keeping access to the planning process in mind.
Thank you, Erin. And then I'll turn it over to Allie's group. Allie, you're muted.
Yes, I am. We had a great conversation, and I too actually couldn't really quite manage the Jamboard. So Chris, Tita, Lori, please feel free to pipe in here. If I've missed anything, I'm just going to do just a couple of key points. One, Tita brought up in regard to the San Diego plan is, how do we sustain funding? How do we keep paying for it once the plan is in place? So kind of sustainable funding sources. One piece that Winton mentioned when he joined us early on was having a time framework. So, they provided 700 recommendations and didn't quite have, let's say, prioritizing in place as to what should, let's say, be implemented first. And also being able to, and I hope I have this right, kind of tracking progress. Later in the conversation, we talked about the importance of engaging policymakers. Policymakers are often with us, not necessarily against us, and that it's really critical to bring them along from the beginning and help them to understand food systems work. Scott talked about engaging with the mainstream farmer and that they are most impacted, and we are not going to be able to regionalize unless the farmer is engaged, and how critical that is. We talked about the importance of banks, CFI, philanthropy, also just the average consumer, and really, bringing people along in that way. So in light of time, I'll stop there. And there's lots in the notes.
Great, thank you, Allie. And because we are a minute short of our end time, I will just say thank you to Winton and Tanya for joining us today. That was great presentations, and thank you so much for joining us for the breakout groups. Thank you everyone here for attending this session. And just a reminder, this is only the second of 4. So we have Rethinking Networking next Wednesday at 6 p.m. That will be a great session. And our final wrap-up session, What's Next, is Tuesday, November 9th. I hope you can join us for one or both of these next sessions. And just thank you to the steering committee and everyone involved for helping plan this. And if you would like to connect, Martha, could you advance to the next slide? If you'd like to connect, you can find us on social media as well as via email. Please contact me at communications@ctfoodsystemalliance.com. I could get you on the listserv and keep you updated on all of our activities. But thank you so much. Enjoy the rest of your day, everybody, and have a good one.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.